In this video, we're going to cover the topic of squatting. And the first squat we're going to go over here, as you see, is the overhead squat. This first position was with a narrow stance. The second, you're going to see me moving into a bit of a wider position. This would be the more common position that most people are being advised to get into a deep squat. Same thing, but now we're going with kind of the arms out in front of the body. And you'll notice here that if you go through this particular variation, the goal of this video is to try and essentially help you figure out what squatting position is right for you. So again, we see this from the side and the arms coming out. You'll notice and you'll feel, if you go through this personal experience, that when the arms naturally gravitate and move out away from the body, it just makes it easier to drop back and to sit into this position, which in turn makes it easier to keep the face behind the knees and the knees behind the toes, as you're noticing in this position. When the hands come up into the overhead position, it's much more difficult to do so. So we'll do the same thing here with now the wide stance position, which again makes it a little bit easier to sit deeply into this position. Now we're looking at a little bit of loading parameter. So now we're looking at a back-loaded traditional back squat position here, again, both with the narrow as well as a bit of a wider stance. Now one of the key points to make here is that particularly when we get into the back-loaded position, the wider stance position, where there's more abduction, external rotation, the thighs are sitting out a little bit wider, the feet are slightly pointed out. This is where you really start to see this particular position make a lot of sense. It's more advantageous for a multitude of reasons, but when the weight is along the back side of the body, I would argue that the wider disposition and basis of the hips is much more advantageous than a narrower position. There is a time and a place for a more narrow position, and you could argue that this would be one of the places where it makes a lot of sense for people. When you get into a front rack position or front loaded position, it places a very different demand on the body. We're using much more of the core here. You'll see a switch into more of a genie grip. Again, this is a little bit easier way of loading in the anterior position here. But again, the key consideration and factor here is that if you're getting into a front rack, front loaded position, that narrow stance helps you pull in your core a little differently. So now we're seeing the same thing with kind of the external abducted position of the hips. Feet are slightly pointed out. And again, for me personally, I like both positions. I get benefit in both out of each of them. So I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but if you have particular issues getting into one of these positions, it's nice to be able to play around. So we see the same thing here. You'll notice here that when the arms kind of come across, for most people, it's easier to get the elbow up and in line with the shoulder than the previous position. Many people are really tight and locked up through their hands and their elbows. So this is one of the ways that it limits us. Here, same thing, front rack position with a wider stance. And for our last variation, we'll move into the overhead squat here. So again, the key here, first with the narrow stance, the arms are locked out, elbows completely locked out overhead, dropping completely down to the thighs being parallel to the ground. Again, in this variation, you can particularly see this from the side. Most struggle as they drop down into this particular disposition, not coming forward from about the mid-back. And so again, you'll notice here the face stays behind the knees and the knees stay behind the toe. Elbows are locked, lats are engaged. You could start even just with a wooden dowel on this one.